Hey kids, howdy, and welcome to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. Here we are in the November becomes December week, kids. We got the 27th of November today, and December 3rd is next Sunday. So we're coming at you for that week.
And we're firmly in Sagittarius season, right?
Yes, firmly in Sagittarius season. Eclipse is way behind us. We do have a full moon at the end of the week. That's sort of the big news of the week. In some ways, there's not a whole lot else that's going on. I'll remind you guys that Mercury started his shadow period on the 25th of November through the 13th. So we are in that period of time where we want to be paying attention to communication gaffes and challenges and problems because they will come up in Mercury's retrograde at the end of the month. So I'll remind you of that. We'll talk a little bit about some stuff that Venus is doing this week because everything she does is more important for the next year because of what she's been doing for the last 6 months. And I thought because there's a little bit slimmer astrology to talk out that would actually answer 2 questions that have come in the last couple of months. You know, I do so much talking about astrology in different places. And when I got this question, I thought, well, I just talked about this. Why? It's like, oh, no. I talked about this in my class, Astrology 101, not here on the podcast. Paula writes really just a great question about the sun and the moon within the natal chart. So, hiya, this might be a question to address at the beginning of the podcast. What is the effect of having one's natal moon at one of the quarters? What effect is there for a full and new and for the first and third quarter? I found out I was born on the day of the first quarter moon. So I was wondering about this sort of moon effect. Thanks, Paula. So let me start with something that's held within the natal chart that's really juicy and powerful as you get to learn who you are based on how you reflect it in your chart. Your sun is your conscious awareness. Your moon sign placement reflects your unconscious. And how they relate to each other geometrically in your chart will describe how you process getting triggered unconsciously and then right yourself back to center. Right? The sun sign is our conscious awareness. The moon is the unconscious. And when we're triggered, it's always a function of something in our unconscious sort of getting lit up. And then we find out about it through the secondary sort of mechanism like anxiety, deep emotions, grief, rage, the reactive piece, right? So you can think of that act of getting triggered as a human being in your life and writing yourself as, well, the style of that. The style of trigger and the style of writing yourself will be reflected by how your sun and your moon relate to each other in the natal chart.
So that's your temperament and personality.
Oh, God, that's perfect. So, yes, because the sun is your personality. And when you use that word temperament, that actually reminds me of your temperament versus her temperament versus their temperament might be the style with which you process getting triggered and coming back to center.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in the quarter moons, we're in crisis. You can start thinking about that just geometrically, the floor and the wall example that I always turn to. They're fighting. They want the other to do the other, right? So if Paula was born in the first quarter moon, what we then know about Paula is when she's triggered, it's undeniable. Squares are undeniable conflicts through which we figure something out. So for instance, my chart, my sun and my moon are in a sextile with each other, which is productive geometry. And as a result, when I'm triggered, I process very, very fast. Which might sound good if you're thinking about what I'm saying, except it's horrible in interactions with others because I'm always ready to forgive and move on before someone else, right? So if you put Paula and me in a room, give us enough of a relationship to trigger each other in a big high stakes way, I'm going to be ready and done within minutes to process, to forgive,
Yeah.
to work it out, to talk it out. And she ain't going to be able to talk about it till that conflict resolves, no matter how long it takes. Paula, you got to be really just gentle and generous with yourself when you're triggered, because how you get triggered is you get thrown into a deep sense of conflict, and you just got to let that ride out until you're ready. So if you're starting to learn your chart, listeners, you can consider what the geometrical relationship between your sun and your moon is. Find out what the archetypal interpretation of that geometry is, and it will reveal to you things about how you process triggered moments and come back to center. It's right there in your chart. This is from a listener named Michael, who is also in his second Saturn return, although is about to go through his second Saturn return. And so since I just went through mine and spoke about it publicly quite a bit, I'm not surprised to have this question. Hello, Michael. You have spoken about your second Saturn return experience a few times. Now that Saturn has entered Pisces, yikes. It will remain in that sign for about 2 years. Yes, 2.5 years. You mentioned that once Saturn return would not be for the entire time Saturn is in Pisces for those going through this process. A few podcasts ago, and now this will be many podcasts ago because I got this email months ago. You mentioned that planetary influences with one another are within an 8-degree range. Yes, he's talking about the orb of influence of 8 degrees. Am I correct in calculating that my Saturn return experience will be from when Saturn hits Pisces at 8 degrees, peak when it is conjunct at 16, and wrap up when it reaches 24 degrees of Pisces? Tried to get a bit of a heads up on my second Saturn return, as there have already been some intense situations from Saturn already being in Pisces. Hope this question will shed some guidance for all. Thank you. Namaste, Michael. And yes, it's a good question, and it's about one of the most important astrological cycles there is, the Saturn return, 29 and 59. Helps us prepare for the next cycle. The first one helps us become adults, and the second one helps us become elders in service. So let me first clear up something about orb of influence. Orb of influence is just the leeway we have to call an angle, even if it's not exactly at that angle. So a square is 90 degrees, but if you give it an orb of, in this case, Michael's offering 8, then we would consider that square a square all the way up to 98 degrees or all the way down to 82. And anywhere in between would be a square. But I want to be really clear about something about orbs of influence. A big, wide orb of influence like 8, which is big, that's for patterns in the chart. You can give a lot of leeway in this orb of influence idea by saying, oh, gee, do I have a square between these two planets? Oh, they're relating to each other at 82 degrees? Yes, that's a square. Oh, they're 98 degrees apart? Yes, that's a square. The orb of influence of 8 gives us a lot of leeway to decide a pattern is a shape, even if it's wider or slimmer than the pure number. But in transit astrology, we have to give a much smaller orb. In other words, for my money, Michael's Saturn return does not start till Saturn gets to the degree point that it was when he was born, not 8 degrees sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wraps up when it wraps up, not 8 degrees later. Now, my second Saturn return happened in 2022, and in March when it started up, the week that it started up was fucking brutal. And January and February were not.
Yeah.
So just even right there, The month it was exact, I started having Saturnian experiences bona fide. But before it hit, not so much. And then when it ended in October, the weekend it ended, I fell on my stairs, I hurt my shoulder, I burned my arm from the banister, and had all kinds of Saturnian experiences. March to October, when it was exact. I would not, now this is me personally, I would not look at orb of influence at all for my Saturn return contextualizing. Is it true that when the planet enters the sign, that we might start being triggered in a Saturn return kind of way, like Michael implied? Absolutely. But in terms of the juicy moments, it's when it hits and when it ends. And that's what I would encourage anybody going through their Saturn return to really be on the lookout for Saturn squeezes, is when the geometry is exact. And if you want to work with orb of influence for a Saturn return, that's a conjunction. I would give it an orb of influence of something like 2. Meaning that if his Saturn is at 16 degrees of Pisces when he was born, he's going to feel it in earnest when Saturn gets to around 14 degrees, but not at 1 and 2 degrees like it is now. So I'll wrap up the finish of this question with saying, I always talk about this, that my physical body is so sensitive to energy. And that's why I teach about astrology from the sense of precision counts. We feel the energy when it's exact. And if it's months before it's exact, it's our mind making us think that the energy is playing out before it really arrives. It's like pretending you're riding the wave that you're looking at, but before you're in the ocean, body surfing that actual wave. You might have a sense of the wave when you see it. Saturn's in Pisces. But you ain't riding that wave till you're riding that wave. Saturn at 16, Pisces. Good luck, Michael. I want to talk about what Venus is doing this week. And there's a really specific reason why. She's doing stuff this week, like typical. Like, it's not like, oh my God, Venus is amazing this week. It's not. But we want to pay attention to Venus powerfully for the next year, because Venus went retrograde last, June through October. Then we moved through an eclipse cycle with both the new moon and the full moon were ruled by Venus. I've said this so many times, I'm getting bored of it myself. Just keep reminding you.
Venus is here.
So much Venus, so much Venus, so much Venus. But what happens, how we sort of want to look at this astrologically is, if Venus is active like crazy during a 4 or 5 or 6 month period, it's like she has an experience. She learned something, right? Now she's going to disseminate and deliver her emotional wisdom for the next year that we will experience at the individual level from Venus transits that play out over the next year. And then the global transits, like what she's doing this coming week, we will feel differently because of how active she's been in the last bunch of months. So that's why I'm giving a little more emphasis, because there's an interesting opportunity that Venus is giving this week as she finishes up her passage through her ruling sign of Libra. So in some ways, because she's at home right now, we're getting the best of what she has to offer in terms of guidance about how we're being with our emotional bodies, because she's singing loudly because she's in Libra. And remember, I'm telling you that she's carrying with her all of the healing, the new levels of deserving, the ability to make new choices that come from more healed emotional spaces. And when we move through Wednesday of this week, Venus is going to cross the south node of the moon. Remember, the nodes of the moon are what generates eclipses. So they still are vibrating with the eclipse energy of the last lunar cycle. So the system is ripe for the south node to give up the ghost of the things we're holding from the past that are in the south node. Venus conjunct the south node on Wednesday will get us in alignment with some of the stuff we have to let go of from the past because of that conjunction. The very next day, so you got to think of this energy as sort of part of the whole week's process. Venus is going to hit Neptune in the great eliminator angle, my favorite 150-degree fork in the road geometry. When it's Neptune that's receiving Venus's transit, we know the theme is about love and intimacy and maybe finances, because Venus rules our relationship to money. But the geometry with Neptune says we're going to see something we hadn't seen before. If you've been following me for a while, and maybe you get my daily astro alerts where I write in such detail, I use this phrase a lot over the last 6 months, which was more will be revealed. And this is a more will be revealed moment. Venus on the south node reveals the thing from the past we've got to let go of. Venus in conjuncting Neptune helps us see what we might have been in denial about in the past. Then over the weekend, Venus will square Pluto, so that if we don't respond to the need to move in new directions and let some things go from a more healed place, we're going to bump into some shadow around love and intimacy over the weekend when Venus is sort of finishing off her Libra passage. And then next Monday, she'll change signs. And that's the first thing I'm going to talk about in next week's pod. So, as you move through this week, some of you will be having some deep emotional releases that might look like endings or letting things go at long last because you've come into a more healed place with what you desire and feel deserving of in the world of love. So I saved the best for last, kids, because we're in the full moon. We're in the full moon as you are listening to this podcast, probably because the podcast comes out at midnight on Sunday, and the full moon was 16 minutes after midnight, as Sunday was becoming today, Monday. So we are in the full moon in Gemini right now. When the sun is in Sagittarius, we are aligned with our higher level of thinking. Whereas the opposite sign, where the moon is in this full moon, Gemini, we're in our pedestrian level of thinking. Gemini invented words and language, perception, ideas, contextualizing our lives through our ability to mentally understand it. In oppositions in astrology, there's always sort of like an amplified, transmuted, transformed sense of what the one sign carries and what the other sign generates. So that if Gemini is where we understand pedestrian thought, it's Sagittarius that helps us spin those thoughts and ideas into higher forms, like laws, spiritual principles, things that we learn, right? So Sag represents education. Sagittarius represents travel and the urge to move about the world and understand other cultures. So we can think about that as a form of education, that the travel impulse can also be connected to the desire to learn about other places or experience them, right? So that's what we have in our conscious awareness in the Sag Mansion, is all of those higher level, expansive, joyful, wonderful ways we get to explore the world, learn more, grow as we go, have lots of fun and joy. It's Jupiter sign, so it's all about joy. But when we want to look archetypally at the Gemini full moon, we really want to hone in on the Sagittarius consciousness of higher thought so that we can use the full moon in Gemini's archetypal consciousness to get rid of and release levels of lower thought that we're ready to drop. Anxious thinking, overthinking, monkey mind, being too distracted. Both Gemini and Sagittarius can have a lot of distractible energy.
Mm-hmm.
They're both mutable air signs, after all. Like it's like air sign means intellect. So we're in the mind, but mutable is fluid, flexible, changeable, right? So the distractibility function is also a perfect sort of release engagement in the Gemini full moon. In fact, I love in full moons because we're considering, what we're letting go of. And very often people will say, well, I don't know what to let go of in the Gemini moon. It's like, what a perfect full moon to use my favorite sort of generalized release prayer. I am now ready to release anything and everything that distracts me in my mind from my true purpose. And here's the juicy part, both known and unknown, conscious and unconscious, so that I might function at a higher level of joy, expansion, and yummy.
Mm.
And so it is. People will sometimes ask me, do I only set intentions in the new moon? Do I only harvest the benefit in the full? No, it's like we should be setting intentions with every breath that we take. We do it at the lunations to have a practice that aligns our movement for the world and the beautiful movement of Gaia, which we are one with. There's a nice trine between the moon and Pluto, which we love in any full moon for Pluto to be involved in harmonious geometry, because a full moon release is like a death. We have to let something go, and Pluto allows us to do that level of change with more grace. There's a level of importance to this full moon because it squares Saturn. Sun in a square with Saturn means our conscious awareness is gonna be aligned with what we're learning, what we're struggling with. In fact, you can guarantee that if there's a struggle and a lesson that you need to learn, it will come up over the weekend. That's a for surezies,
Okay.
because Saturn is squaring both the sun and the moon. Put them together, obviously, it's a full moon if the sun and moon are both squaring Saturn. But yeah, sun and Saturn in a square will make our conscious awareness aware of what the lesson is at the moment. So, like, none of us are going to be escaping the slowdown that Saturn will bring to point out the lesson if there's one on tap for us this coming Sunday and Monday. And then the moon squaring Saturn adds the unconscious, doing the same kind of setup for being stopped in our tracks if there's a lesson to learn. Anytime Gemini is featured, we've got to remind you guys of the power of perception. Everything about how you experience your life in a body is because of how you are perceiving what's happening. And that's the something that can be changed. We cannot change who we are. We cannot change our personality and makeup. We can heal wounds and become more actualized of who we are. But like I like to say, I've healed all my ancestral wounds, but I still have an unconscious and a personality. But perception is everything about how we experience the world outside of us. So this is also a wonderful full moon to sit down and ruminate how much freedom and healing you are experiencing in how you're perceiving your world. Like, we always want to make sure we're practicing our gratitude and release. So this would be a great, because it's a Gemini full moon, and Gemini is about words and the mind. It's a great full moon to use journaling and writing as your ritual. And we want to make sure we address the gratitude portion and the release portion. So if you haven't done something for the full moon yet, sit down with your journal and write an inventory of all the ways that your perceptions have risen to higher levels of awareness because of the healings you've been engaged in. And then take some time to write about all of the patterns of thought or perception that you are ready to be done with or are in the process of healing because of all that, we've been carried through the last 6 months, and write it down in the way of Gemini, because the twins need to talk, and write out everything that you're lifting up in gratitude and ready to release, and have at it.
Did you know that Michael has a daily astro alert? If you enjoy hearing the weekly astrology, you might like knowing more about each day. When you subscribe for the daily astro alerts, you'll get an in-depth explanation of the day's astrology sent right to your email. Subscriptions are only $10 a month, or you can purchase the yearly subscription at the reduced price of $100. To subscribe, head over to michaellennox.com. All right, it's dream segment time. Every week, Dr. Michael will interpret dreams that are sent in via email or take a live caller. If you would like your dream interpreted on the podcast, you can go ahead and email us at dreams@michaellennox.com. Hopefully your dream will make it onto the show. So while we were recording the astrology segment, I remembered there was an eclipse in my dream last night, and I was in a
Oh, I
car,
love
and someone
that.
was like, "Oh, look," and I was like, "That's an eclipse," and yeah,
Well,
I
I
watched
love
it
it, and as a
happen.
dream interpretation, Zoe, I would offer you that eclipses are about faded transformation and change.
Huh?
So a dream about seeing an eclipse is a dream about noting and recognizing the deep changes that are happening at the moment for you, both personally and interpersonally, because you're connecting it to a collective experience of change and eclipse. Beautiful.
Yeah. Right before I went to bed, I read the 5th chapter of the book All About Love, the book by Bell Hooks. And that chapter is on spirituality and love and how that, like her beliefs on that in your life. Yeah, and it was really powerful. So
I
it's probably
love
the
this for you, Zoe. Of
connection.
course, everything we
Yeah,
consume the day before shows up in our dreams, and then we get to combine them. That if this is a dream that represents a kind of profound moment for you to be in radical acceptance of all the change that's happening, and what fed you into that thought was contemplations about love, I'm calling that a yummy, juicy dream.
totally.
Yay.
Okay. It's funny because the dream I'm bringing in is quite different. Rasa, she writes in, "Hi Michael, I had a dream last night. I was with company, and in that company was Donald Trump in his 40s. I thought he was handsome. I ended up sleeping next to him. I could feel how uncomfortable I was just barely touching his side. It was very dark energy radiating from him. I was laying down and thinking, why am I doing this?" The end. In real life, I do not like him as a person. Any ideas what this could be about?
Oh my
Just such
Lord.
an odd little vignette.
Well, it's perfect. It's a beautiful, simple little, dream. I I will say I think this is the first time that I'm hearing somebody offer a dream with Donald Trump in it.
Yeah, honestly, I'm very surprised.
Yeah, well, it's like, why haven't I heard this before? Why aren't more people dreaming about Donald Trump? He's everywhere
Right.
in our zeitgeist, in our consciousness. Alright, so how do I want to interpret this dream? Well, I'm gonna inch through. Let's start that I'm with company.
Mm,
Right? And she says very little other than that. She says, "I'm with company," and in that company was Donald Trump
mhm.
in his 40s, right? So, we grab a lot out of the opening visual, which is Rasa with company. So, we're in a dream where Rasa is considering aspects of her life that are public and shared, right? She's not walking on a little path in the woods or, in a cabin somewhere alone, right?
Right.
She's with company. So she's considering what it's like to be with others and, in community. Now, when Donald Trump was in his 40s, it was the height of some of his nefarious activities. It was Atlantic City and the great failures there and his sort of entrance into gambling. And I mean, I'm from New York, right? So, like, anybody who's from New York has had a relationship with Donald Trump since he was in his
Mm,
40s. very public New Yorker who was largely thought of as a buffoon and a schmuck and derided, and he was known to be a bad landlord. And I mean, this was not like news to any. Like this, we all knew who Donald Trump was in the 80s when he was in his 40s. So we have to come up with some interpretation that we can offer to represent Donald Trump in his 40s for Raza. Now, if Raza were here, I would get that more from tossing it to her and hear her perseverate
Right.
about her, thoughts about Donald Trump. So because we can't do that, I have to sort of offer my own. And certainly because Trump's in his 40s, this is long before television, reality TV, and presidential elections, he was simply ruthless and ambitious. So as a character, as an avatar, because he's famous, he enjoys, as a symbol, a kind of aspirational interpretive quality to represent avarice, greed, ruthlessness. And she thinks he's handsome initially.
Mhm.
So we have to separate out these two acts in the dream. One is, I think he's handsome and I find myself sleeping next to him, and then I'm wildly uncomfortable just touching his side, right? Those are contradictory, but there you have it. We have to include both. So if I perceive in this dream landscape Donald Trump as a amplified avatar of greed, ambition, that the dreamer thinks is handsome, then I think we're having a dream experience of where Raza finds an edge to her own ambitions and where it makes her uncomfortable just imagining being more focused on ambition for ambition's sake. Now, you can't dissect from this dream Donald Trump's current role in our zeitgeist projection screen, where now he represents also a threat to democracy, changes that are possible in the United States that would be beyond anybody's recognition of what this country is should he win the presidency next year. So that has to be included in our interpretation of the dream, that Raz is also sort of getting in touch with the darkness in the zeitgeist at the moment and feeling uncomfortable about it, right? So I think that the dream operates in two ways. And one is collective and very much about the current landscape of Donald Trump and the darkness of what's happening in the planet and the scariness associated with that possibility, and a more personal, just Raza in relationship with her own ambition and how that might feel a little bit dark if she goes too much in the direction of ruthlessness in her ambition. That feels dark and uncomfortable. I feel the dream has to be operating on both levels because I think we're that complex. We're never just dreaming about one aspect with leaving other aspects out. And she finishes off what she says to us with the question, why am I doing this? Like, I'm thinking in the dream, why am I lying down with the source of my fear and disdain? Now, we can both sort of understand what she's talking about, right? She's having an image that's sort of like, antithetical to what she would imagine herself doing in real life. She asks herself the question, why am I doing this? But if she were here, I'd be like, well, what else do you think you meant by why am I doing this? Like there'd be a question and answer we could engage in. Suddenly, I'm reminded of this idea of none of us escape, that we have to somehow take this image that's in our zeitgeist, in the collective landscape. This Donald Trump has risen up and we must relate to him. And I think this dream on certain levels is helping Raza process that. So in the spirit of this dream reflecting something collective, but also maybe personal, on the collective side, I think it's pretty obvious that this dream is simply a reflection of what we all have to do with this moment in our history. What other side you're on, we have to acclimate to this conflict that's rising up. we're in a, we're on a side where we'll be talking about Donald Trump as the other, but we could just as easily be having the same conversation about like us liberals being the other. And they are no more wrong or right than we are. Like, that's the problem. And the conflict in our world is that squares don't get resolved or the building falls down. On a collective level, this is just Raza reflecting something we all have to do with the darkness that's out there that we have to lie down with. We are already lying down with Donald Trump in a way, right? And we all have to sort of, contextualize that in any way that we can. On the personal level, Raza, I would invite you to look at where in your life ambition is important, and then take a look at where ambition for you might turn into something that you perceive as dark that might need a little bit of healing attention. So I invite you to ruminate on that, if you will.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the Daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.